On Chav Ches Amud Beis, the second line down, Alma Kasova Rava, Mitzvos Ein Tzrichos Kavon. We see from the fact that Rava had paskin on Chav Ches Amud Aleph that Tokel L'Shir Yotza, and he didn't have Kavana L'Shem Mitzvah, but yet he's Yotze the Mitzvah. Esvei Vayakore Torah. This is Mishnah, beginning of the second parak of Brachas. He's reading the Torah, V'Higia Zman HaMikra. And the time for Kriyat Shema has come. And he's reading in the Seder HaParshiyos, the Parsha of Kriyat Shema. Can he fulfill his mitzvah just by reading it within the Torah? Im kiven libo yotza. If he had kavana, then he was yotzim lav lo yotza, which seems to indicate that you need kavana lotzes and mitzvah srichas kavana, and that's a contradiction to Rava in Tokel L'Shir. My love, shouldn't we assume kiven libo lotzes? That only if he had kavana to be mekayim his chovas kriyat shema, then he's yotze, and only then he's yotze, meaning that mitzvah srichas kavana. And it's interesting to me that the Gemara doesn't even suggest the difference between kriyat shema and other mitzvahs. That maybe kriyat shema, insofar as it is kabbalah sol malchus shemaim, it requires kavana. But now we're just simply talking about kavana l'shem mitzvah. Let's say sidei chovav. And from that perspective, Kriyat Shema is a mitzvah like any other mitzvahs, and we should compare it to shofar. Lo, the Gemara says you're not understanding the Mishnah properly, but rather when it says kiven libo, it means likros. He does not require a kavana lotzei sidei chova. All he needs is kavana to read. Now, what does that mean, kavana to read? He is reading. Likros hakakari, but rather b'mi shekori lagia. He's really looking in the Sefer Torah. He's a sofer, and he's reading the psukim in the Torah to see if there are any mistakes. And he doesn't really have in mind kriya to read it out loud at all. He's basically what you call a misasek. Misasek meaning someone who doesn't have intention even to do the maisa. Forget about l'shem mitzvah. Maybe at some point he's mumbling the words, he's not mumbling the words, but he's not being makpid to read the words in the proper way to fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. And in such a case, the Mishnah says that until he is absolutely certain that he had in mind to read the psukim properly, forget about, we're going to drop the requirement of an intention to fulfill a mitzvah because we're holding out like Rava. He's only yotze if that condition is fulfilled. Tashma, we have another proof from our Mishnah on Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Haya over achorei beis hakneses. It's Rosh Hashana. He passes a shul. Oh, shoya beiso samoch lebeis hakneses. Maybe he has a porch that's close to the shul. The shama kol shofar or kol megillah. In the shul, they're blowing shofar Rosh Hashana, or alternatively, on Purim, they were reading the Megillah. And the Mishnah establishes that in Kiven Libo, Yotza. Once again, we're going to assume that Kiven Libo means he has to have Kavana Lotzes. The Im Lav, if he didn't have Kavana Lo Yotza, my Lav, Im Kiven Libo Lotzes. So that he hears the shofar perfectly, or the Megillah, but he didn't have Kavana Lotzes Yidei Chovasa. And according to Rabbi, he should still fulfill his mitzvah. And yet the Mishnah says, lo yotza. If he doesn't have kavana, lo yotza, lo. So that's not what the Mishnah refers to. But rather, kavana here means lishma, that he should have kavana to make sure he has the intention to listen and hear the kol shofar, or the kol megillah. So the Gemara says, Shema, how can you interpret the Mishnah like that? For Hashana, it says that he heard the kol shofar. If he didn't hear the kol shofar, there's nothing to discuss. So what do you mean, kiven l'shma? And the Gemara answers, savur, in the case that he's not Yosef, because he didn't have kavanah l'shma, He was of the misimpression. This is not even a kol shofar. He thought it was chamor bi'almo. He's just listening to the sound of an animal. And apparently the sound of a chamor, what's called in Hebrew na'aras hachamor, is very similar to the shofar itself. And if he confuses it in his mind and he thinks he's not hearing a shofar, ask him what he's hearing. He'll tell you he's hearing a donkey. Well, that's called Masechet. He doesn't even have kavanah for the maisa of shmiyas hashofar. Esvei, the Gemara asks the following question on Rava, to object to Rava. We have a brisa regarding Tkiyah Shofar Niskavi Nashomeya V'lo Niskavi Mashmiya Mashmiya V'lo Niskavi Shomeya Lo Yotzach Niskavnu Shomeya Umashmiya. We need a kavanah both on behalf of the person who's blowing the shofar, so that he knows that he has in mind the shomeya. And the shomeya has to have in mind that he's yotze the mitzvah of shofar. When it says that he's not yotze, if only the mashmiya, the blower, the shofar blower had kavanah, but not the listener, that I can reconcile with Rava. Why? Because savar chamor bi almahu. When it says lo niskavin shomeya, again, the shomeya was misasek. He didn't realize that he was listening to the shofar. He thought he was listening to the sound of a chamor. Elo, but niskavin shomeya v'lo niskavin mashmiya. What does it mean that the shomeya understood he was hearing kol shofar, but the mashmiya, the blower, was not aware, and therefore the shomeya is not yotzech mishkacha? So what is exactly the scenario? Lav, shouldn't we assume bitokel shir? It's exactly the case of Rava, that the mashmiya, meaning the blower, had in mind for music. He was training himself for music, and he didn't have in mind l'shem mitzvah, to be yotzei this yidei chovasna. And once again, we say he's not yotzei because mitzvah's kavana, and that contradicts Rava. Our answer is Dilma. Perhaps we can interpret it thus, that when the Brisa says that the mashmiya didn't have kavanah, it means the kamenabach nabuche. He wanted to blow shorter tkiyos that don't have a shear of tkiyah. And instead, what came out of the shofar were tkiyos hara'uyos that had the shear of tkiyah. So in effect, he never had kavanah for a tkiyah, because that which came out is not a tkiyah, meaning it's not a chefta of a kol shofar, it's less than a shear of a kol shofar. So if he happened to accidentally blow a shear of kol shofar, that's called misasik, where you didn't have kavanah for the maisa. And as a result, the shomeya can't be yotze. The question that we have here is, what about the mashmiya? Meaning the emphasis here is on the shomeya. Avol in this kavin litkoa kishir roy, if he in fact had kavanah to blow a longer tkiyah, even though he was doing it for training for musical purposes, he did not have kavanah l'shem mitzvah b'yotze because of Rava's principle of mitzvah saying shrichas kavanah. Now, at this point, the Gemara is going to integrate the question of mitzvah shrichas kavanah with another issue, which is the violation of the lav of Baal Tosef. Amalei Abaye l'Rav Elamayata, according to you, that even if you didn't have kavanah l'shem mitzvah, but you did the ma'aseh mitzvah, and you had kavanah for the ma'aseh mitzvah, not for the lotzes yidei chovaso, then the conclusion should be hayoshen bashmini basukah. If on the 8th day of Sukkot he sat in the sukkah, he slept in the sukkah, Yilke. We know that that's not so, but according to your reasoning, Rava, the byproduct, the end result is that he should get malchus for violating Baal Tosef by sleeping in the sukkah on the 8th day. You'll tell me he didn't have kavanah l'shem mitzvah. But that doesn't matter. The Ma'aseh Mitzvah itself is a valid Ma'aseh Mitzvah, even without Kavanah. And not that it's relevant for being Yotzei Mitzvah, obviously it's the 8th day of Sukkot, but it's relevant because a Ma'aseh Mitzvah on the 8th day of Sukkot is a violation of Baal Tosef, meaning you see here clearly that if you hold Mitzvah Tzrichas Kavanah, then in the absence of Kavanah, you don't even have a Ma'aseh Mitzvah. You need the Kavanah to set up a Ma'aseh Mitzvah. And therefore, Yoshem B'Shmini, without Kavanah L'Shem Mitzvah, that's not even a Ma'aseh Mitzvah, because Mitzvah Tzrichas Kavanah, but according to you, Rava, Mitzvahs ain't Tzrichas Kavanah, then he should get Malchus for the Ma'aseh Mitzvah of sitting in the Sukkah on the 8th day. Omalo, so Rava responds by Shani Omer, Mitzvos ain't over aleim ela bismana. The reason, says Rava, that we know for sure Mekubal b'Yadenu that Yoshem B'Sukkah Yom Shmini ain't a loka, that's because of a contingency in the violation of Baal Tosef. It has nothing to do with Ma'aseh Mitzvah, not Ma'aseh Mitzvah. And that is that Baal Tosef means that within the framework of the Zman Mitzvah, like let's say, for example, he would take 5 minim for the lulav, 5 parashias for the tefillin, 5 tzitzios on his talis. That would be a violation of Baal Tosef because that's bismana. But if you take a mitzvah that has a limited amount of time and you perform the mitzvah outside of that time framework, like you adding days to the mitzvah, that's not a violation of Baal Tosef. That's nothing. You haven't changed the mitzvah. To change the mitzvah by adding to the mitzvah, you have to do within the time frame. And it would matter not whether you had kavanah l'shem mitzvah or not kavanah l'shem mitzvah. It's irrelevant. If it's not bismano shel mitzvah, then it's not Baal Tosef. It's like, for example, if I would shake a lulav on Tu B'Shvat, that would not be Baal Tosef. Baal Tosef means to add to the mitzvah b'shaito in its time. So therefore, if you ask me, says Rava, why Yoshem B'Sukkah B'Shmini doesn't get Malchus, is because there's no Baal Tosef in this case. It's not Bismana Mitzvah. The 8th day is not Bismana Mitzvah. And now the Gemara is going to attack this principle, this premise of Rava, that Baal Tosef is only violated within the framework of the time of the mitzvah. Mosiv Rav Shimon Bar Abba, he raises the following objection to Rava. Minayin lekohen, we have a brayso that says Minayin lekohen she'ol leduchan. He goes up to Duchan and he's blessing the people with Berchas Kohen until Yomar. He should want to add an extra bracha. We have 3 brachas. And he's going to decide that whole v'nasna la Torah reshus levarach es Yisrael. God already appointed us as Kohanim to be mevarech. Then osif bracha achas mishali. You know, the floodgates are open, the license is there. I'm going to add another 4th bracha, kigon. And if he's intelligent, he's sharp, he's going to pick out the bracha that Moshe blessed the people of Israel at the beginning of Sefer Dvarim. Hashem Elokei Avosechem, Yosef Aleichem, Kachem Elef B'Yamin. May God, the God of your forefathers, add to the brachos and expand the blessings 1,000 times over. And therefore, by adding that extra bracha, he's saying, all right, these are the standard minimum 3 brachas. Yivarech Hashem b'yishmerecha, Yer Hashem paravelecha b'chuneka, Yisa Hashem paravelecha. Now I'm adding another bracha over here, Yosef Aleichem. And it sounds very intelligent and very tempting, and a loving Kohen would want to do this. Talmud Lomer, the Torah says, Lo tosifu ala dovar asher anochi mitzaveh eschem. You're not allowed to add. The Torah says, recite and bless 3 brachas, not a 4th. And that, by the way, according to Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank in one of the famous tshuvas, says it's a problem if the Kohen comes down for the duchen and say Yashar Kochtim and he answers Baruch Tia or anything of that sort. Chazak v'amatz, he's adding an extra bracha. He just got down from the duchen. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, this is after the Zman. Why should the Brisa be concerned about Baal Tosef? He already finished the mitzvah. The Zman of mitzvah is gone. He already recited all 3 brachas. Now he's adding a 4th bracha. Hahacha keva de barech, he already fulfilled his mitzvah and he recited 3 brachas. Over leizmane. And nevertheless, the Brisa says, Vikatani, the Ovar, he violates Baltos by adding a fourth bracha. And the Gemara answers, where did he add the extra bracha? He weaved it in, he wedged it in to the middle of these three brachas. Let's say, for example, he recited Yivarech Hashem V'yishmerecha, Yer Hashem Parav Elecha, we connect the first two. And before reciting Yisa Hashem Parav Elecha, he adds Yosef Hashem Al Keavosechem Kachem El Piyamim. So he's within the framework of the mitzvah, and he's jacking up the number of brachas from 3 to 4. He violates Baltos. If he had finished the third bracha, the last of the brachas, and then he added a fourth, he would not be in violation of his oath of Baltos. The Gemara says, wait a minute. The Brisa says explicitly, take a look. For Asanya, we have maybe a different Brisa, but the Brisa says Siyam. After he completed the 3 brachas, the Kohen added a fourth bracha, and he violates Baltos. My answer is, the Brisa that you're quoting means Siyam bracha achas. After he finished the first bracha Yivarecha, then he added the bracha Hashem al Kevel Seichel. So it's within the framework and the Zman of the mitzvah. Asanya, what about another Brisa that we have? And a Kohen adds a bracha michalo after Siyam kol brachos. What could be more explicit than this Brisa? He finished already all his brachos. It's after the Zman of the mitzvah, and yet he violates Baltos by adding a fourth bracha. Says the Gemara, Shani Hacha, Keva de Ilu Misrami Le Tzibur Achrina, Odar Umavarach, is Kuli Yomas Manehu. Every day generates its own obligation of Birchas Kohanim. And even if he was Mavarech one Tzibur, another Tzibur comes along. Like today, this is very common. You have Shtibuch and you have minyanim one after the other. So the Kohen remained after the first minyan. He's preparing his Daf Yomi, Masechet Rosh Hashana. Meanwhile, the second minyan started. They need him, and he's obligated l'chorah to be mavarich them. Is kuli yom zmani. The entire day is considered zmani, and he can violate baltosif within the framework of a full day by adding an extra bracha. Now, at this point in the Gemara says that we are going to try to prove from a Mishnah in Zvachim that if the Zman of the mitzvah is still in existence, still outstanding, then it's still considered zmana. For example, let's try to, so far it sounds very abstract to say that if it's still possible to do the mitzvah again a second time around, it's still zman. Nesinas dam al mizbech, that's what we're going to discuss. And the mitzvah of nesinas of matan domim in kodshim, in zevach, divides into 2 categories. One category is called matana achas, and the other is called arba matanos. Arba matanos means to put the dam on all 4 sides, all 4 corners of the mizbeach. Let's give examples. We have, again, what you might call lower echelon karbanos, bachar, meiser, in other words, every 10th animal, meiser behema, carbon pesach. And those are called damam nitan matana achas. All you need is 1 matana, nesinas adam, on that side of the mizbech, which is called keneged hayisod. Okay, these are dinim and kodshim that we don't have to go into now. However, the more classic karbanos, which fall into the categories of shlomim, osham, ola, carbon toda, these are called shtei matana shein arba, meaning you really have to put the dam on all 4 corners of the mizbeach, but the way we do it, the way we implement it is we put it on 2 corners that are diagonally zeh keneged zeh, and the dam sort of flows down from the corners on two ksolim. So basically you cover all four sides of the Mizbeach. That's called shtayim, because he only really does two matanas, but shein arba. Now, what we're about to learn in the Mishnah in Zvachim Adaf Pei is the halach of tarobos. Let's say the dam of different karbonos gets mixed together. The dam of a bechar, for example, gets mixed up with the dam of an ola, let's say in one receptacle, in one mizrach, one klisharetz. Umina Taimra, the Gemara says, how do you know that the principle is that if he can still fulfill the mitzvah again, it's considered zmana, like we saw in Berchas Kohanim the entire day, if another tzibur knocks on his door. Disnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Hanitonim v'matana achas, shenis arvu b'nitonim matana achas, if you have a mixture of two damim, of two different karbanos, both of which require one and only one nesina, that's not an issue. For example, you have a mixture of dam b'chor with dam meiser behema, or with another dam of a b'chor, of a different b'chor, is yitnu matana. So then he certainly, with one matana, he fulfills both. And we're assuming that within this tarobes, he'll have a representation, so to speak, of some of the dam of this and dam of that, of the two karbonos he's yotze. And the same principle applies in a mixture of matan arba, b'matan arba. So you had two olos that got mixed up, or an ola that got mixed up, the dam of an ola with the dam of shlomim. Is he nasnu b'matan arba? And that's fine, because by doing the matan of what we call shtei matana shein arba, he's covered all his bases. Because in this tarobas, he's got dam from the ola and dam from the shlomim, or dam from this ola, dam the other ola. Okay. Now we get to the more complicated cases. Matan arba be-matan achas. Let's say that the dam of bechor, which is matan achas, got mixed up with the dam of an ola, which is matan arba, shtaim shein arba. And now he's really in a bond, because if he does only one matana, then he's over baltigra with regard to the ola that requires shtei matana shein arba. If on the other hand he does shtei matana shein arba, then he overstepped his bounds as far as the bechor is concerned, and now he violates Baal Tosif. So which direction should he go? And here's a machlokes tanoim recorded in the Mishnah in Zvachim. Rabbi Lezer Omer, yinosnu b'matan arba. And now the question is going to be obvious. On the side that he's doing matan arba with the dam of the bechor that's mixed in, he violates Baal Tosif. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, yinosnu matan achas. But again, we're going to have the same question in the opposite direction, that as far as the dam of the ola is concerned, or the dam of the shlomim, whatever it might be, he's violating Baal Tosif. I'm sorry, Baal Tigra, I meant to say. And that's going to be the discussion back and forth. Amalo Rabbi Loza, Rabbi Loza turns to Rabbi Yeshua. How can you do one nesina? Baal Tigra. Amalo Rabbi Yeshua. And what are you recommending? That we do a matan arba who over Baal Tosif. So Rabbi Loza defends himself by saying, Lo nemar Baal Tosif elikshu bi atzma. In other words, when he's doing this as a suffix, if he has just the dam of the bechor, and that's all he has, and he does a matan damim of arba, and then he violates Baal Tosif. But now that he has a mixture, he's not interested at all in a zrik of the dam bechor on arba kronos mizbeach. That's not his interest. He's just trying to be yotzei al sofek. Maybe the dam is the dam ola, and therefore there's no Baal Tosif. Amalo, Rabbi Yeshua responds to defend his position. Lo never Baal Tigra elikshu bihatzmo. I'm going to apply the same logic as you, and when he does a matana achas here, and you're telling me that for the ola it's Baal Tigra, he's only doing it, it's suffix. And therefore there should be no violation of Baal Tigra. And let's be consistent. If there's no violation of Baal Tosif in a suffix, then there's no violation of lo tigra in a suffix. The ode, and now Rabbi Yeshua really reveals his reasoning, his logic. Oh, Rabbi Yeshua, kishalona sata, if you didn't do matan arba, but rather you followed my recommendation, you did only matan achas, avarta al bal tigra, velo asita mais. What you did is what you omitted the other matanos, b'shevi altas, passively. The other matanos would have been necessary for the olah. But it's not called a maisa b'yodayim. That's called bal tigra. However, if we do it the way you advocate, Rabbi Lev, shenasata, you're going to put 4 damim, avarta al bal tosif v'asisa maisa b'yodecha. You violated this Isur V'kum V'aseh actively, not just B'Shevi Al Taseh. And therefore, it would be a better idea to violate Bal Tigra B'Shevi Al Taseh rather than Bal Tosif V'kum V'aseh. So now the Gemara is going to see how this proves our point. V'ahacha kevan diyoyev le'matana mi-b'char avro le'zmaneh. The katani di avra mishum baltos. It's Rabbi Yeshua in his objection against Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer agrees to this following principle, that there's a problem of baltosif when he adds matana of arba to the matana of achas. So we're talking about violating baltosif for the dam b'char by jacking it up from 1 to 4. Well, guess what? It's already after he fulfilled his mitzvah with the first matana. So it's no longer zmane as far as bechar is concerned. Elav, the only fallback position we could have here as far as baltosiv is mishum damrin and kevan de ilu misrami le buch achrina. If at that period of time another bechar would come up, hadar mazah mineh, he would obviously be obligated to be mazah the dam and the mizbeach and kula yom zimne. Therefore, the whole day is considered this dam of zrikas damin, the zman of zrikas damin. So even though he fulfilled his mitzvah with vis-a-vis this bachar with his dam of zrika and matan achas, the mitzvah, the time mitzvah for the mitzvah is not passed, is not terminated, because he will be choser v'zorikas adam. And the same thing with Birchas Kohanim. If another tzibur comes along, we'll apply the same logic, and therefore it's still zmane. The Gemara says, I don't like that raya at all. Mimai, how do you know that the reason that the Mishnah says that when he puts the dam b'char, more than one matanach, he violates baltos, is because the whole day is considered zmano, dilma, maybe because of Rabbi Yeshua, mitzvahs over aleim, afil shalom is zmano. Maybe we're holding now that even though you finish the zman of mitzvah, nevertheless there's still baltosiv. And now the kasha is on Rava. When the Kohen adds a bracha, birchas Kohanim, after he finishes all the mitzvahs, he's going to violate baltosiv. And that's against Rava, who says that it's only bismano. So the Gemara answers, Hanan, hochi kamrino. I understand that the kavana in this Mishnah, and who was the one who quoted this Mishnah? It was Rav Chaman. Let me just make sure I got the name right. Sorry. Anan hochi kamrina. We're going to try to prove that this is the intention of bringing this Mishnah, because Rav Shaman or Shmon Bar Abba, my taima shavik masnisen umosiv mibraisa. The kasha here of Rav Shaman comes from a brisa. Second. Yeah, Mosiv Rav Shimon bar Abba. Earlier on this Amud, it was actually Rav Shimon who raised the price of Minayin L'Kon Shalol L'Duchen, that if he adds an extra bracha, he violates Baltosiv, a fourth bracha. And now the Gemara wants to know, why does he ask his kasha from a brisa? We have a rule that if you have a kasha to ask for a Mishnah is much more reliable and powerful, authoritative than a brisa. Why didn't he ask his kasha from the Mishnah in Zvachim, in which Rabbi Yeshua says that if you add an extra zrika, in the case of a Bechor, you violate Baltosiv, which again would contradict Rava, who says that Shalom Bizmanim, after Zmanim, there's no Baltosiv. Why did Rav Shaman feel compelled to stretch his arm out with his dissenting raya against Rava from a brisa when he could have quoted a Mishnah? The brisa of Birchas Kohanim is only a brisa. The Mishnah of Matan Doma Rabbi Yeshua is a Mishnah. Losiv mi masnisa. The answer is masnisa my time alo mosiv. Why is it that Rav Shaman did not quote the Mishnah to raise an objection to Rava? Came on the iu misramile buchra achrina boy maza minei kuli yoma zimnihu. The answer and the defense for Rava with regard to the Mishnah in Zvachim is very simple, and it's obvious. And that is that since if he has another Bechor on that day, it's still he would have to be Zorik Adam. It's still considered Zmane. And Brisa, in the Brisa that says the Kohen adds a bracha to the three brachas of Birchas Kohen, violates Baltosiv, Nami, Keva di Misrami Tzibur Achrina, Hadar Mevarech, is Kuliyoma Zmane. Now that we have the obvious answer from the Mishnah in Zvachim to defend Rava, we apply that to answer the objection of Rav Shaman from the Brisa of Birchas Kohen. So the Gemara is explaining that there's no difference between the din and the Mishnah with regard to Bechor to the din of the Brisa with regard to Birchas Kohanim. If we're going to say the Svara, that since if the mitzvah comes available, he goes back and he does the mitzvah during the entire time, then there's no objection to Rava, not for the Mishnah or the Brisa. If we're going to say the Svara, on the other hand, that once he finished the mitzvah, it's Aras Mane, then we don't understand why Rav Shaman bar Abba asked his kasha from the Brisa to object to Rav. Why did he bring it from the Mishnah? So Gemara explains Rav Shaman bar Abba, who asked the kasha from the Brisa, not from the Mishnah, he holds that you can make the following distinction between them. Asam in regard to the Mishnah with regard to Bechor, that if he has an opportunity that comes along, knocking on his door for another Bechor, lo sagi de lo yoed, he has no choice. He's obligated to do the matan domim on the mizbeach of the second Bechor. It's not a question of option. It's not a matter of his decision. He is obligated to do so. I mean, the Carmel Kampasel, if he doesn't do this Rika, and he's being Gorim Hefsek Kodshim. So that's called Kol Hayom Zmana L'Mitzvah, the Zmana Mitzvah. But here in the case of Birchas Kohanim, Iboy Mevarech, Iboy Lo Mevarech. He's not obligated to recite a Birchas Kohanim. Another tzibur comes along, he has a right to say, look, I have a daily obligation to recite and bestow the brachos. I did so. I fulfilled my obligation. You can't force me to be mevarech against my will a second time around. And if it's totally my das, then this is not considered, the whole day is considered as one mitzvah. And therefore, we understand very well why Rav Shaman preferred to ask his question objection against Rav from the Brisa, because as far as a Kohen adding another bracha is concerned, after he's already recited the first three brachas, violating Baltosiv, that means even after the Zmana Mitzvah Avar. And now the Gemara goes back to the kasha that Abai had raised against Rav, that if mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana, why doesn't he get malchus for sleeping in the sukkah on the 8th night of Sukkot? And it seems that at this point, the Gemara is dropping the ball on the first explanation that we gave to defend Rava by saying, well, there's no Baltos because it's the eighth day. Now we're assuming that there could be Baltos if even after the Zman HaMitzvah passed. But Rav Amar Lotzeis Lo Boy Kavan, Lav or Boy Kavan. With regard to mitzvahs, we don't need Kavan. But there's one exception on the Lav side, and that's the Lav of Baltosif, and you don't violate Baltosif unless you have Kavana to violate Baltosif. And we can appreciate for sure, we can appreciate the Gemara's logic, the compelling logic. I mean, Baltosif means you're trying to change the mitzvah. If you don't have Kavana to change the mitzvah, it's very comfortable and pleasant for him to sleep in the sukkah another day. It's a hot, it's a hot sukkah, and he wants on the eighth day to sleep. That's not Baltosif. So the Gemara raised the question, how can you tell me that without Kavanah L'Shem Mitzvah, you're not violating Baltosif? But Matan Domim L'Rabbi Yeshua de Lavar, the Dama B'char, when it got mixed up with another karba that requires Matan Arba, Rabbi Yeshua says that you should not do a matana of more than one of the kronos in his bath, because if he does more than that, he violates Baltosif. And yet he's not doing it in order to change the mitzvah. He's only doing it because he wants to fulfill the possibility that there's, that he needs his rika on the Dama Ola or the Dam Shlom, whatever it might be, Velo Boy Kavana. Rabbi Yeshua doesn't say that only if he is Kavana in order to fulfill the mitzvah, and he will violate Baltosif because he wants to expand the mitzvah. But rather here he's not trying to expand the mitzvah. He's doing an extra matana going beyond one in order to fulfill that obligation that's incumbent upon him. He writes here, Lo hitzrich Rabbi Yeshua she's kavin l'shem mitzvah k'dei laver b'Baltosif. Sharekshu no say me adamim shenisariv yosem mi matonachas ain't kavin also litem l'shem b'char. Right, the mitzvah that he is violating Baltosif, according to Rabbi Yeshua's logic, if he would add more than one matana, is the mitzvah of matan damim b'char. He has no intention with the extra damim to expand the number of zrikos of matanas for a b'char. He's only doing it because of the mixture here of dam that requires arba. Elama Rava, therefore Rava backtracks. And again, if you ask me why Yashem B'Sukkah Yom Shmini Loka, Ein a Loka, is because Latzes Lo Boy Kavan. Lavar, to violate Baltosif, if he adds to the Ma'aseh Mitzvah, is Bismano Lo Boy Kavan, Shalo Bismano Boy Kavan. In a case where he's adding to the Ma'aseh Mitzvah within the framework of the time period for that mitzvah, then it's irrelevant, says Rabbi Admit, whether he has Kavanah L'Shem Mitzvah and he will violate, he has in mind, to expand the mitzvah, violate Baltosif, or he doesn't have that in mind. In the case of Dam B'char, where there's a mixture of that Dam with another Dam of Matan Arba, if he's going to put more than a Torah Achas, he's going to violate Baltosif, because even after he finishes the matana of the Bechar, it's still considered Zmanohu, because maybe perhaps he'll chance upon another Bechar, and he's going to be required to put that dam on the Mizbeach. So the entire day is considered the Zman HaMitzvah. But in a case where he will only be violating Baltosif after the Zman HaMitzvah, on the eighth day, Shalo Bizmano is Boy Kavana, then he would only be violating Baltosif if he had Kavanah L'Shem Mitzvah. And therefore, in the case where he sleeps in the sukkah on the eighth day, which clearly he's not interested in L'Shem Mitzvah, he's just enjoying the sukkah as if it were a covered porch with a pergola on it and so forth. That doesn't fit the bill of Kavanah L'Shem Mitzvah, and since Shalom Bismano, then, so according to Rava, it comes out that there are two categories of Baltosif. There's a Baltosif where you're changing the mitzvah, Bismano. And it's irrelevant whether you had kavanah l'shem mitzvah or not. You are changing the mitzvah and adding to the mitzvah. But if it's shalom b'zmano, then you have to sort of like create a brand new mitzvah, shalom b'zmano, and you have to inject into your action the status of ke'ilu or ma'aseh mitzvah, which you do with kavanah. And we'll conclude the Amud with Amalei Rabbi Zera l'shamoy. Rabbi Zera instructs his shamish, his second in command, on the top of Chav Tesam and Alfi, Chavenu Tkali. Have kavana to blow the shofar in order that I should be yotzei my chiyuv. Alma kasava, we see that Rabbi Zera holds that in order for the shomea to be yotzei his chiyuv mashmiya boy kavana, the one who's blowing the shofar has to have kavana to be motzi. Now let's not confuse this with mitzvah srichas kavana. That's not what we're saying here. We want to get a tziruf between the Baal Tokea who's doing the Maisa mitzvah of Tekiah and the Shomea. That Maisa Tekiah can only relate to the Shomea through a tziruf. We need a positive connection between the two, and that we can only achieve through Kavana Lahotz. And therefore he says, Ichaven Itkali Tiskaven Litkoa Lishmi Lahotzieni Yedei Chavasel. That will connect the Tekiah of the Tokea with the Shomea. And we'll stop here with Meisvei, which Amir Hashem will pick up tomorrow. Let me wish you a Shavua Tov. And thank you for joining me for the second half of Chav Ches here in Rosh.